Alzheimer's, uh, it's a tough one, isn't it? Really tough disease for everyone involved.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, for the individuals and families who are dealing with it, it's just such a huge challenge.
It is. But what's exciting is that there's been a big shift towards early detection of Alzheimer's. And that's what we're going to be diving into today.
Yeah, that's a huge change because for so long we've been kind of stuck in this reactive approach, just waiting for symptoms to show up and then trying to manage the disease.
Yeah, that's right. So we're going to look at the research behind this and how these new blood tests could change things completely.
Blood tests, yeah, they hold so much promise. I mean, imagine being able to detect Alzheimer's years before any symptoms even appear. That's the game changer right there.
Absolutely. So today we're going to look at what's driving this research, how we currently diagnose Alzheimer's, how these tests actually work, what the findings are, and what it all means for the future of Alzheimer's care.
It's a fascinating area with a lot of exciting developments.
It really is. Now, one thing that really stood out to us is the story of Dr. Evelyn Reed and her personal connection to this research. What was it about her story that really resonated with you?
Well, for me, it was that her motivation wasn't just purely academic. It came from a very personal place. Her grandmother had Alzheimer's, and she saw firsthand the devastating impact it had on her and the whole family.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's got to be tough to watch.
It is, and that personal connection, that deep desire to be able to intervene earlier in the disease process, that seems to have been the driving force behind her work. It's just so powerful.
It is. It's amazing how often those personal stories really fuel those major scientific breakthroughs.
Yeah, definitely. And it really highlights that this isn't just about some abstract science. It's about tackling a very real human challenge.
It is. And, unfortunately, a lot of our listeners are probably familiar with Alzheimer's, whether it's a family member, a friend, or even themselves who've been affected by it. Yeah. So before we get into the blood test, let's talk about how Alzheimer's is currently diagnosed.
Okay, so currently it's often a multi-step process. Doctors usually start with cognitive tests, those memory and thinking tests. We've all probably seen those kinds of
Like
things.
remembering a list of words or something.
Exactly. And they'll also do neurological exams, checking reflexes, coordination, things like that. But often, to get a really clear picture, they need to do more specialized tests.
So what are some of those more specialized tests that they use?
Well, one is a PET scan, which is a brain imaging technique. They use it to visualize amyloid plaques, which are these abnormal protein deposits in the brain that are a hallmark of Alzheimer.
I see. So it's like a way of actually seeing those plaques in the brain.
Yeah, exactly. It gives them a visual representation. And then another method is analyzing cerebrospinal fluid, which is the fluid that surrounds the brain and spinal cord. They look for specific proteins in this fluid that are associated with the disease.
Ah, okay. So they're looking for like protein markers in the fluid that indicate Alzheimer's.
Exactly.
And how do they even get that fluid? I mean, is it a simple blood draw or?
No, unfortunately, it's not that simple. It involves a procedure called a lumbar puncture, which I'm sure some people listening might have had or know about.
Yeah, I've heard of those. Aren't those a little bit uncomfortable?
Yeah, they can be a bit more invasive than a simple blood test, that's for sure.
So it sounds like the current diagnostic process for Alzheimer's is quite complex and it can be pretty invasive and time consuming. And the other big problem, as we mentioned with Dr. Reed, is that all of this is usually done after someone's already showing symptoms.
Right, right. And
Mhm.
that's the biggest challenge. By the time someone starts experiencing memory loss confusion, those really noticeable symptoms, the disease has probably been developing for years, maybe even
Oh,
decades.
well, so by the time they catch it, there could already be a lot of damage.
Exactly. There could be significant irreversible damage in the brain. So it's like we're always playing catch up.
And that's where these blood tests come in, because they could potentially detect those early warning signs long before any damage really starts to happen.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And that's the game changer here. The potential to identify those at risk or in the very early stages of the disease before significant brain damage occurs. That's the real promise.
It's like shifting from a reactive approach to a proactive one, which is so important.
Absolutely. And one of the most exciting aspects for me is the potential for much wider accessibility.
Yeah.
I mean, imagine a world where a simple routine blood draw could tell you about your risk for Alzheimer's. That's pretty incredible.
Yeah, that would be revolutionary. If
Yeah.
that's something that so many people could have access to, regardless of their location or their financial situation. It could really level the playing field when it comes to diagnosis.
Definitely. And it could also have a huge impact on research. I mean,
Right.
think about it. A simple blood test could make it so much easier to recruit participants for clinical trials, especially those focused on preventative therapies, because you could identify people in those very early preclinical stages where interventions might be most effective.
Right. That makes sense. So instead of waiting for symptoms to appear, you could actually start testing treatments on people who are at risk but haven't developed the disease yet.
Exactly. And that could significantly speed up the development of new treatments.
This is also fascinating.
Okay.
Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty here. How do these blood tests actually work? What are scientists looking for in our blood that can tell us what's going on in the brain?
Sure. So basically, the idea is that the changes happening in the brain in Alzheimer's, those amyloid plaques and tau tangles we talked about earlier, they might release detectable signals into the bloodstream.
Ah, so it's like those brain changes are leaving a trace in the blood.
Exactly. And those traces, those signals, are what scientists are trying to pick up on.
Okay, so what kind of signals are they looking for?
Well, initially, a lot of the research focused on directly measuring amyloid beta and tau proteins in the blood. But the problem is that the concentrations of these proteins are often very low in the blood, especially in the early stages of the disease. So it was really hard to get an accurate measurement.
Oh, so it's like this signal was too faint to be reliable.
Yeah, something like that. So they needed to find a better, more sensitive way to detect those early brain changes.
Okay, so what do they do?
Well, the breakthrough came when they started looking at other blood-based biomarkers that were more sensitive indicators of those early brain changes.
Okay, so they weren't looking at those same proteins directly anymore. They were looking for something else.
Yeah, that's right. They shifted their focus. And a lot of the recent research has been focused on phosphorylated forms of the tau protein, which they call p-tau.
P-tau. Okay, and what's so special about this p-tau?
Well, it turns out that these specific modifications of the tau protein are more readily detectable in the blood, and they show a stronger correlation with the actual Alzheimer's pathology in the brain.
So it's like p-tau is a more reliable signal of what's actually happening in the brain.
Exactly. And different forms of p-tau, which are called isoforms, they seem to be particularly relevant for Alzheimer's diagnosis.
Ah, so they're not just looking at p-tau in general. They're looking at these specific types of p-tau.
Yeah, exactly. They're trying to get as specific as possible. And in addition to p-tau, they're also investigating other markers related to things like inflammation in the brain and neuronal injury.
So it's like a whole panel of biomarkers they're analyzing together to get a really comprehensive picture.
Precisely. It's like putting together a puzzle with different pieces of information from the blood to get a clearer picture of what's happening in the brain.
That's a great analogy. So
Yeah.
they've identified these potential biomarkers, but do they actually work? I mean, have there been any studies to show that this approach is actually effective in diagnosing Alzheimer's?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There have been a lot of large-scale studies that have looked at this, and they've analyzed blood samples from different groups of people, those with confirmed Alzheimer's individuals with mild cognitive impairment and healthy controls.
Okay, so they were comparing the blood of people with Alzheimer's to people who didn't have the disease.
Exactly. And what they found is that this panel of specific p-tau isoforms, often combined with other biomarkers, can differentiate between these groups with really high accuracy.
Oh, wow. So the blood test can actually tell who has Alzheimer's and who doesn't with a pretty high degree of certainty.
Yeah, and that's even in cases where the symptoms are very subtle or not even clinically apparent yet.
That's incredible. I mean, that's a huge step forward, being able to identify the disease so early on.
It really is. And it's not just about identifying people who already have the disease. The research also suggests that changes in these blood-based biomarkers can predict who will develop Alzheimer's in the future.
Wait, so they can actually predict who's going to get Alzheimer's based on their blood?
That's what the research is suggesting. And they're doing these longitudinal studies where they follow the same individuals over a period of time and take repeated blood measurements.
So they're tracking those biomarkers over time to see if they can predict the development of the disease.
Exactly. And it's looking very promising. So we're not just talking about early diagnoses, we're talking about potential prediction, which is just mind-blowing.
It's like having a crystal ball almost. I mean, knowing years in advance that you might be at risk for Alzheimer's, that could completely change how you approach your health and your life.
It really could. So it's not just about giving people a diagnosis, it's about giving them the information and the time to make informed decisions about their future.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's say this blood test becomes widely available. What are the next steps? What needs to happen to make this a reality for patients?
Well, there are a few key things.
Yeah.
First, they need to do even more research, larger studies with more diverse populations to make sure the test is reliable and accurate for everyone, regardless of their age, ethnicity, and other factors.
Right, because you want to make sure it works equally well for everyone who might need it.
Absolutely. And they also need to keep refining the test itself to improve its accuracy, make it easier to use in standard clinical labs, and hopefully reduce the cost.
So make it as accessible and affordable as possible.
Exactly. And then, of course, there's the whole regulatory process, working with agencies like the FDA to get the test approved for widespread use.
Right, because there's a lot of testing and evaluation that needs to happen before something like this can be made available to the public.
Yeah, definitely. It's a rigorous process. But the good news is that the research in this field is moving really fast and there's a lot of momentum behind it. So hopefully it won't be too long before these tests become a reality.
Dr. Reed mentioned that it could be within the next few years. Does that seem realistic to you?
Yeah, I think that's definitely possible. I mean, the strength of the research findings and the clear need for early detection, I think that's going to help expedite the process, assuming the further validation studies continue to show positive results. So I'd say it's a very real possibility.
So within a few years, we could potentially have a simple blood test that can detect Alzheimer's years before symptoms even appear. That's pretty amazing.
It is. And think about the impact that could have. Imagine being able to identify people in those early preclinical stages and start them on preventative therapies.
Yeah, or enroll them in clinical trials for new treatments. It could really accelerate research.
Exactly. And it could also change the way we think about clinical trials for new treatments. I mean, instead of just relying on cognitive assessments, we could use these objective biological markers in the blood to see if a treatment is actually having a real effect on the underlying disease process.
Oh, I see. So you could track those biomarkers over time to see if the treatment is actually working.
Precisely. It would give researchers a much clearer and earlier indication of whether a drug is actually doing what it's supposed to do.
It would be huge. I mean, it could make drug development so much more efficient and targeted.
Definitely. And then there's the personal impact for individuals and families. I mean, early detection, while it would come with its own challenges, it could also empower people to make more informed decisions about their future. They could start planning for care, they could make lifestyle changes that might have a positive impact, and they could explore opportunities to participate in early intervention strategies or clinical trials.
So it's about taking control of the situation instead of just feeling helpless.
Exactly. It's about being proactive and engaging with your health in a more empowered way.
It's a really hopeful message, I think.
Yeah, and it's a testament to the power of human ingenuity and perseverance. I mean, think about it. We've gone from understanding the devastating impact of Alzheimer's on families to the verge of having a simple blood test that could change everything.
That is really inspiring.
And what I find particularly remarkable is how a personal story like Dr. Reed's experience with her grandmother can fuel such incredible scientific progress. It's a reminder that behind all the complex science, there's a very human element driving it all.
Absolutely. And it gives me hope for the future. A future where diseases like Alzheimer's don't hold the same power over us. A future where we can detect and treat these conditions much earlier and more effectively.
It's a future worth striving for.
Yeah.
And it makes you think about the challenges that lie ahead. I mean, with the increasing ability to detect diseases earlier, how do we as a society need to adapt to support individuals and families who are navigating these early diagnoses and all the choices they might face?
That's a really important question, and one that I think we'll be grappling with more and more as these technologies continue to develop.
Absolutely. It's something for all of us to think about.
That's a great point to end on. So to our listeners, what do you think? How do you think our society should adapt to support individuals and families facing early diagnoses? Let us know your thoughts, and we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.
Until then, take care, everyone.